So before we answer the question you asked before about will we see palm trees in the Arctic anytime in the near future? Well, hopefully not, even though you don't want to rule out the possibility that we will not be careful enough on increasing our emissions and continue to warm the planet and so on. But then the key question is, has there been a time in the past when there were palm trees in the Arctic? Well, there is at least one study which claims that this indeed did happen. So I have taken again the time series or the time record of past temperatures. Remember, we estimate them using ice cores and tree rings and so on, which we will again look at in this book in a few chapters. And we are going back in time here from now to about 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were just breathing their last, and we are looking at polar ocean equivalent temperature, which means we use some chemical to estimate the change in the temperature with respect to a baseline. Always remember, baseline is important, because when you go back in the past and we look at ice cores and tree rings, they are not thermometers. A thermometer mother uses to say, wow, you have a fever or you are fine, because it's giving you exact temperature. When you go and measure these things indirectly, they are giving you relatively warm or relatively cool compared to the baseline. So if we go and look in the past, around 55 million years ago or so, after the dinosaurs had probably disappeared completely, there was a very sharp jump in temperature, and it's called the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. And you can see that in this entire record, such a large, quick, rapid jump is not obvious. Obviously, it's not clear in the scale how fast that has happened. What you want to understand is whether the warming we are doing now since Industrial Revolution is actually as fast as this, or is it faster, or is it slower, and so on. But nonetheless, when such a big temperature jump happened, and it lasted long enough to create a spike of maybe 12 degrees centigrade warmer in the polar ocean than today, obviously all the Greenland glacier would have been blown away, all the Arctic ice would have been blown away, and depending on how long it lasted, you would have had palm trees in the Arctic. Okay, so obviously we will see some figures about how dinosaurs themselves were living in a very warm time, very high CO2 time, and they were wandering in over the Antarctic and over the Arctic Circle because it was warm, and there were forests and there were dinosaurs eating vegetation and so on and so forth, which we already looked at, I suspect. Yeah, we did. So we will then keep this in mind, that in the past there have been records of being so warm that there were probably palm trees in the North Pole. Why is it important? Because that means we can again get such a situation if we somehow create the conditions for such a warming. And I won't go into the details, but this tells you what is possible in our Earth system if we keep emitting greenhouse gases. Okay, so we should probably read this part first before we go to the chapters that we mentioned in the table of contents of this book. Once upon a time there were palm trees at the North Pole. Can you picture that? The most tropical trees in a place where now there is only snow and ice. So you had tropical vegetation way in the north, where now we have cold temperatures with polar bears and snow and ice. In the future they might reappear because the climate is constantly changing. During the ice ages it was much colder than it is now. In the days of the dinosaurs it was much warmer as well, as I mentioned. However, in recent years the climate has been changing pretty quickly. That's why so many people are talking about climate change. So it's a question of how rapidly are we warming compared to some of the past example. It's a complicated story though, involving a bit of physics, a bit of chemistry, geology, biology, meteorology, and other sciences like genetics and vegetation response, species responding, and so on. How can amateurs like you and me ever hope to understand? The author is talking about himself here because, of course, we want to know what's going on with the polar bears, the hurricanes, and all the fires and flooding. In the previous book on What is Climate Change by Gail Herman, we discussed some of this, so some of this may be a repetition, but you can hear again, listen to this again, and reinforce the concepts with some slight different ways of telling this story from the past into the future. Oops. That's why I have spent a few years collecting information from all over the place, from the internet, newspapers, television, books, and from people who know lots about the subject. Let's say somebody like me. I've put all together for you and for me in a way that should make sense at least most of the time. Okay, but if there is something you don't understand, it's not a big deal at this age. You just listen to it, keep in your mind, and go forward. Keep going, and you will soon get it. And you will ask your teacher, parent, grandpa, brother, sister, and so on. You're going to see that the big story of climate change is about much more than polar bears and exhaust gases that are coming out of the factories and the cars and so on. That's why it takes a bit for them to come into the story, so we will keep on going and they will eventually come into the story. But first we need to talk about the volcanoes, mammoths, and shivering scientists who go to these cold polar latitudes, Arctic and Antarctic and Greenland, and collect all this evidence and do the great science for us. Then you can read all about climate change today. What's going to change? Who will be affected? Will there be some people who will be safe? If so, who are they, and do they care that some other people are getting affected? Where and why and when and how? Is it real? We already talked about the climate politics. We know that it is real from the science side, but are you convinced? Are you willing to accept what the science is? And will you still be able to take a hot shower every day if it becomes so hot that you need cold shower, and there will be no cold temperature anywhere, and only air conditioner can provide you some cool air? But then what happens if everybody starts using air conditioner? Will that be good for the climate or bad for the climate? So here is a mammoth that is looking a bit scared. If you've seen the movies Ice Age, then you know there are characters in there of a mammoth and a lion and a saber-toothed tiger and so on and so forth. So here are some amoeba looking things, bacteria, and everybody plays a role in climate change, so we will come back and start to learn about them. So let's read this and leave this podcast here. The first chapter starts with snowballs and volcanoes, which we talked about before. If you are just starting with this section, it's okay. Here you will read that the history of the earth has had a lot of ups and downs, where the first rain came from, how the earth has changed into a snowball from top to bottom, what sort of scary critters crept and crawled among the first plants, and why dinosaurs died out, and how a few giant farts from the sea caused a heat wave. In short, we will read about the early history of the climate. So let me stop here and take this phone call.